Hey guys, so we're finally going to be moving away from the ancient Middle East, and we're going to be talking about ancient India for the next 3 or 4 days. And we're going to start with the earliest civilization that we know of in the area, known as the Indus River Valley civilization. But before we start talking about that, of course, we're going to talk about geography. And Indian geography is unique in all the world in a couple interesting ways. First of all, India is a subcontinent. And so what this means, more or less, is that the Indian peninsula, as we know it, is actually its own independent continental plate, which maybe you have learned about in geography class. But this means that, anyway, for a long time, India was a huge island. It was its own continent, kind of like Australia, floating in the Indian Ocean. And over millions of years, it drifted northwards and eventually crashed into the southern part of Asia. And this crashing had several interesting geological effects, but the most important one was that it caused the Himalayan mountain range to form. And so the Himalayas are the largest mountain range in the world. They're where Mount Everest and K2 and all those other famous mountains are. But they're important for history because this enormous mountain range isolates India from other civilizations for a long time. And this allows India, kind of like we talked about with Egypt, to develop its own unique culture. So south of the Himalayas, there's this really fertile and flat river valley, or area with lots of rivers. And the two most important rivers that you need to know about are the Indus River, where civilization starts out, and the Ganges River, where it spreads later on. One other interesting thing about Indian geography is that it is subject to these cycles of weather called monsoons. And what that means is that every year India goes through a really dry period in the fall and winter, and then it goes through an incredibly wet period in the summer. And this is important for agriculture because it allows Indian agriculture to be really fertile, even in places where they don't have access to rivers for irrigated agriculture and all of that stuff. But so anyway, back to the Indus River Valley. So this is the first civilization on the Indian subcontinent, and it exists from about 2500 BC to around 1000 BC, more or less. And so just like in Egypt and Mesopotamia, it was based on farming along the banks of the river. So just like the other rivers, this river would flood, deposit rich soil, and then you could use the river waters to irrigate this soil and grow whatever crops you needed. And these crops were the same as in Mesopotamia: wheat and cows and sheep and dates and stuff like that. Yeah, they were also the first people to grow cotton and use that for clothing, interestingly enough. So this civilization is the largest civilization. It's larger than any other civilization until the Persian Empire conquers most of the Middle East. So for a long time they're the biggest, and they're also the most mysterious because unlike the civilizations in the ancient Near East, we have not been able to understand their system of writing. And so what this means is that all of our knowledge of this civilization has to come from what we find in archaeological sites. And what we have found in these archaeological sites is even more puzzling. It seems that the Indus River Valley civilization was an entirely peaceful society. And that we think this because archaeologists have never discovered a weapon in any of the archaeological sites along the Indus River. Instead, what they have found lots of are pieces of board games and tokens. And so what it seems is that rather than fighting wars, the people of the Indus River Valley civilization lived peacefully and enjoyed playing games with one another. Interesting. We also know that they engaged in trade via the ocean with the Mediterranean civilization, because we found lots of stuff from the Indus River Valley civilization in Mesopotamia. And the greatest achievement of the Indus River Valley civilization are its great cities. And these two cities, the two greatest cities rather, are Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. And both of these cities are enormous. They're about 3 miles around. So what is that, like a 1 mile more or less diameter. Pretty big for an ancient city. And not only are they huge, but they are very well organized, which indicates some kind of strong or well-advanced central government. And the streets are gridded, they crisscross, making it easy to find your way around. And they're also all a uniform size, depending on how important they are in the city's layout. We also know that there are centralized storehouses where all the grain of the city would be kept and then distributed to the individual houses later on. And there was modern plumbing. There were wells dug every so often throughout the city, so everybody had access to water. And for wastewater and for sewage, there was a unique drainage system that would carry all of the wastewater far away from the city to keep it from contaminating the drinking water. This is a development that Europeans wouldn't figure out until well into the modern era. Until that time, they would be drinking more or less their own poopy water. So in this way, the River Valley civilizations were very advanced. And one other really mysterious thing is that in their great city of Mohenjo-Daro, instead of any kind of temple up on like the high ground where other societies would put their palace or their temple, what they have is a great bath. It looks kind of like a big swimming pool. And we don't really know what it's for. It could have served a religious practice where people would go bathe and ritually purify themselves in some way, which is what happens later on in certain other Indian religions. Or maybe it was just a place for recreation and relaxation, like a community swimming pool. This would fit in with all the board games and other things found in the Indus civilization. But in spite of their awesome cities, and perhaps predictably because of their lack of weapons entirely, the Indus River Valley civilization eventually declined and disappeared. And at first, the decline is gradual. And so from 1750 to 1500 BC, they undergo a slow decline, and the cities become more chaotic, and the pottery becomes less nice, and you can just tell that things aren't as good as they used to be. And most historians think that this was originally due to some kind of environmental problem. Either environmental degradation, that is, they didn't take good care of their forests and their soil and they ran out of resources, or some kind of great catastrophe, like an earthquake or a volcanic eruption or something like that. But really we don't know. It's just clear that things aren't going as well as they used to for the Indus River Valley. But then, as things are already going poorly, they get even worse with this thing called the Aryan migration. And this is the final blow to the Indus River Valley civilization. And so the Aryans were a nomadic people. We'll talk more about them in a second. They were also a warlike people, and they migrated in great numbers from the north through a pass called the Khyber Pass that led them through the Himalayan mountains. Actually, another part of the mountain range called the Hindu Kush, but that's not important. And these guys carried with them advanced weapons. So not only did they have weapons, but they had advanced weapons like chariots that they used to defeat their enemies. And what this meant is that over time, the original people who lived in the Indus River Valley were either replaced or subjugated, that is, turned into a lower social strata, a strata of servants and slaves. And so the Aryans, who are these guys? Well, like I said, they were warlike nomads. And most historians think that they were herders seeking a place to pasture all of their livestock. So all of their cows and horses, they needed somewhere to graze them. And so they were seeking this place and moving southward, looking for a place where they could stay for a while. And this led them over the mountains and ultimately into the river valley, where instead of just pasturing their horses, they decided to go ahead and take over this ancient civilization. And the leaders of the Aryans were apparently warriors who fought with each other and against their enemies in massive chariots using bows and arrows. So kind of like the Hittites and the Assyrians, which we've already talked about. There's a really dramatic picture of what it might have looked like. Another thing that was interesting about the Aryans is they had a rigid system of social stratification in which the warriors were on top, then the priests, and then at the bottom were the workers and the herders and the farmers and stuff like that. Pretty typical, right? The people who actually do all the most important work are at the bottom. And they carried with them some important advances, well, some important differences in terms of religion and literature. First of all, they carried with them a written language that we can understand, which is called Sanskrit, but they also carried with them these long poems, which were hymns to the gods, which we'll talk about more, and these were called the Vedas. And these Vedas formed the foundation of the Indian religion known as Hinduism. And so after the Aryans take over the Indus River Valley, they settle down. I guess they figure it's a nice enough place, they can give up their old nomadic ways, and they take up farming. And so rather than continuing to move on, they live in villages, and they use the same agriculture that the Indus River Valley civilization had already been using. They also spread east, going from the Indus River to the Ganges River. And the Ganges River has an extraordinarily fertile plain, and once they settle there, the Ganges becomes the center of Indian civilization. So that's a really important river to remember, and we'll talk more about it later. And then they go on to found multiple rival kingdoms, and just like you would expect a bunch of previously barbaric wandering warriors to do, they begin to fight wars with each other pretty quickly. Something else interesting happens when the Aryans settle down, and this is that in the old system of social stratification, the warriors were on top, but soon the priests rise to the top, and the warriors serve the priests who hold the highest position in society. And this happens for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's because both the warriors and the priests believed that only the priests could communicate with the gods. And it was incredibly important for the priests to communicate with the gods, because the gods were the people who would bless certain warriors in battle and would bless certain fields to ensure that they were fertile and stuff like that. So the priests' ability to communicate with the gods was essential for the success of any culture, or so the Aryans believed. And the priests' main activity was ritual sacrifice. And so they believed that fire was a gateway to the world of the gods. And so what the Brahmin would do is that basically every day they would ritually burn certain things as offering to the gods. They would offer up milk and meat, especially, as offerings to the gods. One last important thing is the caste system. And so in the caste system, it's a kind of a new version of the old Aryan system of social stratification. And in the caste system, the Brahmins are on top, followed by the warriors, and then other workers, Aryan workers, farmers, herders, stuff like that. And then at the very bottom of the pyramid were the non-Aryans. So the people who the Aryans conquered became the lowest level of the caste system, and they were basically just servants working for the Aryans. How convenient, right? And so this system with the caste system and the Brahmins and centered on the Ganges River sets the stage for all the later developments that happen in Indian civilization, including the religious breakthroughs of Hinduism and Buddhism, and later social developments and great empires and stuff like that, which we will talk about in the next few days. That's all for today, so check out your key terms and be ready to discuss and review tomorrow. Good night.